On June 7, 1942, exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor attack shocked America into war, Japanese Imperial Navy forces invaded and occupied sovereign United States territory for first time since British forces burned Washington during War of 1812. Imperial Japanese troops landed on Kiska Island and Attu Island, two remote volcanic outcrops in Alaska's Aleutian chain, beginning military occupation that would last over 1 year and result in brutal campaign fought in environmental conditions so extreme that weather and terrain killed more American soldiers than enemy bullets. This campaign, fought entirely on American soil, remains largely forgotten by American public despite thousands of casualties on both sides and strategic implications that affected entire Pacific War. This is complete story of forgotten war that Americans never learned about. Battles fought in hell where visibility measured in feet, temperatures hovered near freezing even in summer, and men died from hypothermia while fighting enemies they could barely see through perpetual fog. Geographic nightmare. The Aleutian Islands stretched nearly 1,200 miles westward from Alaska Peninsula toward Russia's Kamchatka Peninsula, forming natural stepping stones between North American continent and Asian mainland. Chain consists of over 300 separate volcanic islands ranging from tiny rocks barely breaking surface to substantial land masses like Unalaska, most completely uninhabited except for sparse Aleut native populations that had survived in harsh environment for thousands of years. Islands are volcanic in origin, created by Pacific Ring of Fire's relentless geological activity, with many peaks still showing evidence of volcanic origins through steaming vents and sulfurous emissions. Terrain throughout Aleutians is characterized by extreme ruggedness that makes basic movement exhausting challenge even without combat. Volcanic rock formations create jagged peaks and valleys with no level ground. What appears from distance to be smooth tundra reveals itself on closer inspection as treacherous surface of tussocks, frozen ground covered in thick moss, creating foot-high bumps that require lifting legs high with every step, exhausting strongest men within hours. Hidden beneath tundra lies permafrost that never thaws, making digging foxholes impossible and turning any depression into icy pool of standing water. Mountains rise steeply from sea level to heights exceeding 3,000 feet within few miles of coastline, forcing anyone moving inland to climb steep slopes while carrying equipment and weapons. No trees exist on islands due to constant high winds, meaning no natural shelter exists anywhere. Volcanic rock cannot be used to construct protective positions as it shatters unpredictably when struck. Everything about Aleutian terrain seems designed specifically to make human activity as difficult as possible. But terrain, hostile as it is, pales in comparison to weather conditions that define Aleutian Islands as among most inhospitable places on Earth where humans have ever attempted military operations. Weather patterns in Aleutians are dominated by collision between cold Arctic air masses and relatively warmer Pacific Ocean currents, creating perpetual instability that generates storms with frightening speed and intensity. Fog blankets islands approximately 300 days per year, with visibility often measured in feet rather than miles. Pilots attempting to fly missions reported being unable to see wingtips of their own aircraft. Ships navigated by dead reckoning through fog so thick that vessels could pass within 100 yards without seeing each other. Ground forces advanced blindly through mist, sometimes shooting at sounds because they could not see targets. Fog was not occasional inconvenience, but constant presence that dominated every aspect of military operations. Wind in Aleutians routinely exceeds hurricane force, with sustained winds above 70 miles per hour and gusts reaching over 100 miles per hour recorded regularly. These winds blow constantly from west, driven by pressure differentials between Arctic and Pacific weather systems. Wind strong enough to blow men off feet, overturn vehicles, and flip aircraft became normal condition that soldiers learned to work around rather than exceptional event. Willy-waws, sudden violent downdrafts that strike without warning, created additional hazard capable of smashing aircraft to ground or capsizing boats instantly. Rain falls horizontally in Aleutians, driven by relentless winds, soaking through any clothing not specifically designed for Arctic conditions. But rain was often preferable to freezing rain or sleet that coated everything in ice, making surfaces slippery and weapons inoperable. Snow fell regularly, even in summer months, with blizzards developing in minutes and creating whiteout conditions where navigation became impossible. Temperature in Aleutians rarely exceeds 50 degrees Fahrenheit, even in warmest summer months, typically hovering near freezing point year-round. But actual temperature matters less than wind chill effect created by constant gales. Wind chill frequently dropped effective temperature far below freezing, creating hypothermia risk within minutes for anyone not properly clothed or unable to maintain body heat through movement. Combination of cold, wind, and constant moisture created perfect conditions for trench foot, frostbite, and hypothermia that would eventually cause more casualties than combat. Strategic significance. Japanese military leadership recognized strategic value of Aleutian Islands chain immediately after Pearl Harbor attack. Islands formed potential invasion route toward North American mainland, offering stepping stones that could theoretically allow Japanese forces to approach United States or Canada from north. Control of western Aleutians provided bases from which Japanese submarines and aircraft could threaten American shipping lanes, particularly vital convoy routes delivering Lend-Lease supplies to Soviet Union through Alaska. But more importantly, from Japanese strategic perspective, Aleutians represented extension of defensive perimeter that Japan was attempting to establish across Pacific. Japanese strategy called for creating outer defense line that would force America to fight through series of fortified positions before threatening Japanese home islands. Aleutians formed northern anchor of this perimeter, complementing positions in Central and South Pacific. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor attack and commander of Japanese Combined Fleet, viewed Aleutian operation primarily as diversion to support main attack planned against Midway Island in Central Pacific. Yamamoto's strategy called for attacking multiple American positions simultaneously, forcing Americans to divide forces and hopefully drawing American carrier fleet into decisive battle that would destroy American naval power permanently. Plan developed through spring 1942 called for Japanese Northern Force to strike American base at Dutch Harbor on Unalaska Island, approximately 800 miles east of Attu, drawing American attention northward while main Japanese carrier force attacked Midway. After strikes on Dutch Harbor demonstrated Japanese presence, occupation forces would seize Attu and Kiska Islands in western Aleutians, establishing permanent bases that would extend Japanese defensive perimeter and force Americans to defend Alaska approaches. Other Japanese officers saw Aleutians as having intrinsic strategic value beyond mere diversion. Occupation would threaten American territory directly, tying down American forces needed elsewhere. Bases in western Aleutians could support submarine operations against American West Coast. Control of islands would prevent Americans from using Aleutians as staging area for attacks on Japanese territory. After intense debate within Japanese high command, compromise emerged. Proceed with planned attacks as diversion for Midway operation, then maintain permanent occupation of Attu and Kiska regardless of Midway outcome. Japanese Northern Force Vice Admiral Boshiro Hosogaya commanded Japanese Northern Force assembled for Aleutian operations. Force consisted of light carriers Ryujo and Junyo, each carrying approximately 40 aircraft, heavy cruisers Nachi and Maya, light cruisers Tama, Abukuma, and Kiso, 12 destroyers, 6 submarines providing advanced screening, and 4 transport ships carrying 2,500 troops designated for occupation duties. Force departed Japan in late May 1942, sailing northeastern route through fog and storms that characterized Aleutian approaches. Carrier air groups trained extensively for operations in terrible weather conditions, practicing instrument flying and navigation by dead reckoning, since visual navigation would be impossible in Aleutian fog. Pilots knew they would be attacking targets they might not be able to see, dropping bombs on estimated positions, and attempting to return to carriers they might not be able to locate. Despite extensive preparation, pilots remained anxious about operating in worst flying conditions imaginable. Occupation troops consisted of Japanese Special Naval Landing Forces, equivalent to American Marines, selected for Arctic warfare capability. Troops received cold weather equipment and training, though nothing could truly prepare them for Aleutian conditions they would encounter. Officers understood they were being sent to isolated garrison duty in terrible environment with minimal chance of reinforcement or evacuation if situation deteriorated. Dutch harbor attacks. Japanese carriers launched initial airstrikes against Dutch harbor on June 3, 1942, achieving complete tactical surprise, despite American intelligence having detected Japanese fleet movements. Approximately 30 Japanese aircraft attacked through fog and rain, bombing fuel tanks, warehouses, and barracks installations. Attacks set fuel storage tanks ablaze, destroyed several buildings, damaged hospital, and killed 25 American personnel, while wounding additional 25. Americans were caught completely unprepared, with minimal anti-aircraft fire initially engaging attackers. Second strike followed on June 4th, while Battle of Midway was beginning 2,000 miles to south. Japanese pilots again bombed Dutch harbor through terrible weather, causing additional damage to base facilities. But American anti-aircraft defenses were now fully alert, and several Japanese aircraft were shot down. More significantly, one Japanese aircraft crashed on nearby Akutan Island, with pilot killed but aircraft remarkably intact, providing Americans with complete intelligence windfall when recovered and analyzed. Japanese attacks on Dutch harbor accomplished tactical objectives of demonstrating Japanese capability to strike American territory and drawing American attention northward. But attacks failed to achieve strategic objective of forcing Americans to divert carrier forces from Midway, where Japanese suffered catastrophic defeat, losing 4 carriers and best naval aviators. Tactical success at Dutch harbor could not compensate for strategic disaster at Midway that fundamentally altered Pacific War balance. Invasion and occupation. While attention focused on Dutch harbor attacks, Japanese transport vessels approached Kiska Island and Attu Island carrying occupation forces. On June 6th, Japanese troops landed on Kiska without opposition, quickly securing Small Island and beginning construction of defensive positions and facilities. Weather station personnel on Kiska consisted of 10 American Navy personnel operating radio and weather observation equipment. When Japanese troops surrounded station, Americans attempted to destroy equipment and evade, but were captured within hours after brief resistance that killed 1 American. Attu invasion followed on June 7th, with Japanese troops landing on island's main village, where approximately 45 Aleut natives lived subsistence lifestyle supplemented by small government school. 2 American teachers, Foster Jones and his wife Etta, operated school and radio station. When Japanese troops arrived, Jones attempted to use radio to warn Dutch harbor, but was shot dead by Japanese soldiers before completing transmission. Etta Jones and all Aleut natives were captured and held prisoner. Japanese occupation forces began immediate construction of defensive works, supply facilities, and airfield installations on both islands. Kiska received larger garrison of approximately 5,000 troops, given its superior harbor and greater strategic value. Attu garrison consisted of approximately 2,500 troops, establishing defensive positions in mountainous terrain overlooking potential landing beaches. Japanese Navy established submarine base at Kiska with fuel storage, repair facilities, and supply depots. Submarines operating from Kiska began interdicting American shipping lanes and conducting reconnaissance of Alaska coast. Anti-aircraft artillery positions were constructed covering harbor approaches and likely air attack routes. Coastal defense guns were positioned to engage any naval forces attempting to shell island or land troops. Troops dug extensively into volcanic rock, creating interconnected tunnel systems that would provide protection from American bombing and naval gunfire. Japanese engineering capability proved exceptional as troops carved defensive positions from solid rock using hand tools and explosives. Bunkers were reinforced with timber brought from Japan, covered with earth and rock, and camouflaged to blend with surrounding terrain. Machine gun positions were sited to create interlocking fields of fire covering all approaches. Artillery positions were registered on likely landing beaches and approach routes. American response. News that Japanese forces had invaded and occupied American territory shocked American public that had believed homeland was secure after Pearl Harbor. Newspaper headlines screamed, "Japs invade Alaska," and demanded immediate counterattack to expel invaders from American soil. Public pressure for military response was intense, with politicians demanding rapid action regardless of military feasibility. But military reality made immediate response impossible. Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr. commanded Alaska Defense Command from headquarters in Anchorage, with responsibility for defending Alaska territory covering over 580,000 square miles. Forces available were completely inadequate for mission, consisting of fewer than 20,000 troops scattered across enormous distances with minimal equipment, inadequate supplies, and no capability to conduct amphibious operations in Aleutian conditions. Buckner argued strongly for a methodical approach, building up forces in Alaska, establishing forward bases closer to occupied islands, and preparing carefully for eventual counterattack. Navy wanted faster action, but acknowledged that amphibious assault capability did not exist, and ships needed for such operation were committed to operations in South Pacific. Political pressure remained intense, but military commanders insisted hasty action would result in disaster. Through summer and fall 1942, American forces in Alaska expanded significantly. Additional Army infantry divisions arrived, Air Force bomber and fighter squadrons deployed to Alaska bases, and Navy ships were assigned to Alaska sector. Forward bases were established on Adak Island, only 250 miles from Kiska, providing base for air operations against occupied islands and potential jumping-off point for amphibious assault. American air forces began bombing occupied islands whenever weather permitted flying operations, which was rarely. Bombers navigating through fog often could not locate targets, dropping bombs on estimated positions with minimal accuracy. When targets could be located, Japanese anti-aircraft fire was surprisingly effective, shooting down several American bombers. Most bombing missions accomplished little beyond demonstrating American presence and harassing occupiers. Naval forces conducted occasional bombardments of Kiska when weather allowed surface ships to approach within gun range. American cruisers and destroyers would steam close to island, fire salvos at estimated target locations, and withdraw before Japanese coastal guns could respond effectively. These bombardments caused minimal damage to well-protected Japanese positions, but maintained pressure and prevented Japanese from feeling secure. Komandorsky Islands Battle. Largest naval engagement of Aleutian campaign occurred on March 27, 1943, when American cruiser force under Rear Admiral Charles McMorris intercepted Japanese convoy attempting to deliver supplies and reinforcements to Attu and Kiska garrisons. American force consisted of heavy cruiser Salt Lake City, light cruiser Richmond, and 4 destroyers. Japanese force consisted of heavy cruisers Nachi and Maya, light cruisers Tama and Abukuma, 4 destroyers, and 3 transport vessels carrying supplies. Battle began at dawn when opposing forces sighted each other approximately 100 miles south of Komandorsky Islands in open Pacific waters. McMorris immediately attacked, hoping to destroy transport ships before Japanese warships could engage. Battle developed into running fight lasting nearly 4 hours, with opposing forces exchanging fire at ranges varying from 12,000 to 25,000 yards. Salt Lake City engaged Japanese heavy cruisers in prolonged gunnery duel, while Richmond and destroyers attempted to reach vulnerable transport ships. Japanese gunnery proved accurate, hitting Salt Lake City multiple times and causing serious damage. American cruisers suffered engineering casualties that reduced speed, making her increasingly vulnerable to Japanese fire. Situation became critical when Salt Lake City lost all propulsion temporarily, leaving her dead in water under fire from multiple Japanese cruisers. American destroyers made desperate torpedo attack runs to protect crippled cruiser, charging directly at Japanese heavy cruisers in attempt to force them to maneuver defensively. Destroyers launched torpedoes at close range under intense fire, demonstrating incredible courage that saved Salt Lake City from destruction. None of torpedoes hit, but Japanese commander broke off engagement, fearing additional American forces might be approaching and deciding to withdraw rather than risk losing cruisers for sake of supply convoy. Battle of Komandorsky Islands was tactical draw with neither side losing ships, though Salt Lake City barely survived and required extensive repairs. But strategic impact favored Americans significantly. Japanese supply convoy was forced to return to Japan without delivering desperately needed supplies to Attu and Kiska garrisons. Japanese Navy concluded that surface supply operations to Aleutian garrisons were too risky given American naval presence, forcing them to rely on submarines for supply delivery. Inadequate supply deliveries would significantly affect Japanese defensive capabilities when American assault finally came. Operation Land Crab Preparation. By spring 1943, American forces had built up sufficiently to attempt amphibious assault on occupied islands. Strategic debate focused on whether to attack heavily defended Kiska with 5,000 troops or less heavily defended Attu with 2,500 troops. Decision was made to attack Attu first, with hope that success there would force Japanese to abandon Kiska rather than fight hopeless battle. 7th Infantry Division received mission to assault Attu, despite having trained extensively for desert warfare in California, with expectation of deployment to North Africa. Division hastily retrained for Arctic operations with inadequate time and equipment. Most soldiers had never experienced anything remotely resembling Aleutian conditions. Training emphasized cold weather survival, mountain operations, and amphibious landing procedures, but nothing could truly prepare troops for reality they would face. Cold weather equipment provided to 7th Division was marginally better than what troops normally wore, but still inadequate for Aleutian conditions. Soldiers received heavier wool uniforms, parkas, insulated boots, and gloves, but nothing was truly waterproof, and everything became soaked in constant rain. No effective cold weather sleeping bags existed, leaving troops to huddle in inadequate blankets. Rations were standard field rations that froze solid in Aleutian cold. Amphibious training occurred in California waters that bore no resemblance to Aleutian surf conditions. Landing craft crews practiced beach approaches in calm waters, while Aleutian landings would occur in heavy surf with high waves and strong currents. Infantry practiced debarkation in warm weather, while actual landings would occur in freezing conditions through surf that soaked everyone before reaching shore. Intelligence regarding Attu defenses was limited, given fog prevented aerial photography on most days. Americans knew approximately where Japanese defensive positions were located, but could not determine exact strength or configuration. Estimate of 2,500 Japanese defenders proved accurate but underestimated extent of defensive preparations and determination of garrison to resist. Assault plan called for two-pronged landing, one at Massacre Bay on southern coast and another at Holtz Bay on northern coast, with forces converging to trap Japanese defenders between them. Plan assumed that overwhelming American numerical superiority of approximately 11,000 troops against 2,500 defenders would lead to relatively quick victory. Planners estimated 2 to 3 days to secure island, grossly underestimating both Japanese defensive capability and horrific impact of terrain and weather on offensive operations. Attu assault begins May 11, 1943. Transport ships carrying 7th Infantry Division approached Attu Island through fog so thick that navigation was entirely by dead reckoning. Wind exceeded 30 miles per hour with gusts approaching 50, creating heavy seas that made maintaining formation difficult. Rain mixed with snow reduced visibility to 100 yards. Temperature was 36 degrees Fahrenheit, but wind chill made it feel far colder. Men huddled below decks in transport ships, already cold and seasick before battle began, wondering what hell awaited them on island they could not see. Landing craft were lowered at 06:30 hours, crashing into heavy seas that immediately soaked crews and passengers. Many landing craft shipped water over sides, forcing crews to bail constantly while attempting to navigate toward beaches they could not see. Some craft capsized in surf, dumping troops and equipment into freezing water. Men struggled to reach shore carrying 70 pounds of equipment, many succumbing to hypothermia before even reaching beach. Massacre Bay landings encountered less opposition than feared initially, with Japanese allowing Americans to come ashore before engaging. Troops struggled through surf, across narrow beach, and into tundra beyond where movement became nightmare. What appeared from distance to be level ground revealed itself as endless field of tussocks, foot-high bumps of frozen moss that required lifting legs high with every step. Men carrying heavy equipment exhausted themselves within minutes, falling frequently, struggling to maintain footing. Weather deteriorated further through morning as snowstorm developed, reducing visibility to zero and creating blizzard conditions that made navigation impossible. Units became separated, lost contact with each other, and wandered through whiteout conditions trying to locate objectives they could not see. Radio communication failed as equipment became soaked, and batteries died in cold. Officers trying to maintain unit cohesion found themselves commanding handfuls of men rather than full companies. Holtz Bay landings encountered similar chaos with weather, surf, and terrain combining to create conditions that made coordinated military operations nearly impossible. Troops struggled ashore, dispersed through tundra, lost contact with supporting units, and attempted to advance toward objectives that maps showed, but terrain made inaccessible. First-day objectives were completely unachieved as troops struggled simply to get organized and establish defensive positions for night. Japanese defense. Colonel Yasuyo Yamasaki commanded Japanese garrison on Attu with orders to defend island to last man. Yamasaki had positioned his forces masterfully, placing defensive positions on high ground overlooking all approach routes from landing beaches. Japanese had spent months preparing positions, digging into volcanic rock, creating interconnected bunkers and trenches, and registering artillery on likely attack routes. Japanese strategy emphasized defense in depth rather than contesting beaches directly. Yamasaki understood he could not prevent American landings given overwhelming American naval and air superiority. Instead, he allowed Americans to come ashore where terrain and weather would slow them. Then, engaged from prepared positions once attackers were exhausted from movement through tundra and exposure to elements. Machine gun positions were sited to create interlocking fields of fire, covering all approaches to high ground. Japanese machine gunners had spent months familiarizing themselves with terrain, memorizing ranges and landmarks, preparing to engage targets in fog when visual identification would be impossible. Snipers positioned throughout defensive zone picked off individual Americans, remaining hidden in rocky outcrops that provided perfect concealment. Artillery had been registered on every potential target area, with coordinates memorized so that fire missions could be conducted blind in fog. Japanese artillery consisted primarily of mountain guns and mortars that were ideally suited for Attu's terrain. Forward observers directed fire from concealed positions, calling corrections based on sound of impacts since visual observation was impossible. Defensive positions were mutually supporting, with each bunker able to provide covering fire for neighboring positions. Trenches connected positions, allowing defenders to move between locations without exposure. Supply tunnels led to rear areas where ammunition and food were stored in underground facilities, safe from American bombing and naval gunfire. Medical facilities were established in caves, where wounded could be treated with protection from elements. Japanese troops were superbly disciplined and motivated by Bushido code that emphasized death before dishonor. Surrender was considered worse than death, so troops fought with determination to resist until killed. This mentality meant that every defensive position had to be captured through direct assault, since defenders would never retreat voluntarily or surrender when position became untenable. American advance. American forces spent next 2 weeks attempting to advance from landing beaches toward Japanese defensive positions on high ground. Progress was measured in yards per day, rather than miles, as troops struggled through terrain, weather, and determined resistance. Every hill became separate battle, every valley a killing zone, every advance purchased with American casualties. Tundra proved nearly impassable for infantry carrying full combat loads. Troops exhausted themselves within hours, unable to maintain steady advance. Equipment was lost when men fell, sinking into hidden pools of water beneath moss. Radios failed from moisture and cold. Weapons jammed from ice and mud. Everything took longer and required more effort than planners had anticipated. Cold weather injuries exceeded combat casualties through first week. Trench foot affected hundreds as troops stood in cold water for days, unable to dry feet or change socks. Frostbite disabled dozens who lost feeling in extremities. Hypothermia killed men who became exhausted, stopped moving, and simply froze to death. Medical evacuation was problematic given difficulty of moving wounded across terrain and lack of adequate medical facilities. Japanese resistance stiffened as Americans approached main defensive positions. Machine gun fire from hidden bunkers stopped advances repeatedly. Artillery concentrations rained down on American units caught in open approaching Japanese lines. Snipers shot officers and NCOs, disrupting unit leadership. Fog made coordinating attacks impossible as units lost contact with each other and supporting elements. American artillery struggled to provide effective support. Moving guns forward through tundra required enormous effort, with crews sometimes needing entire day to advance single artillery piece few hundred yards. Once positioned, guns had difficulty locating targets in fog. Forward observers could rarely see impacts to adjust fire. Much artillery ammunition was expended, firing at estimated positions with uncertain results. Naval gunfire from offshore destroyers and cruisers provided some support, but accuracy was limited without visual observation. Ships would fire salvos at coordinates provided by ground commanders, but impacts could not be observed to confirm effectiveness. Japanese defensive positions were so well constructed that near misses caused minimal damage, while direct hits were rare given targeting difficulties. Air support was nearly worthless given weather conditions. Bombers could rarely find Attu through fog, and when they did locate island, they could not identify targets. Close air support was impossible without visual contact between aircraft and ground forces. Some missions were flown, but accomplished nothing except demonstrating pilots' courage in flying through terrible conditions. Bitter fighting. By late May, after 2 weeks of battle, American forces had advanced only halfway to their objectives. Casualties approached 2,000 killed and wounded, with equal numbers suffering from exposure and disease. 7th Infantry Division was exhausted, supplies were critically low, and morale was deteriorating. General Buckner visited Island on May 24th, shocked by conditions and appalled by lack of progress. Buckner ordered immediate reinforcement, rushing additional troops from other Aleutian bases to Attu. Fresh troops arrived carrying additional supplies and ammunition, but even fresh troops quickly exhausted themselves in terrible conditions. New arrivals suffered immediate casualties from hypothermia and exposure before engaging enemy. Japanese situation was equally desperate, despite successful defense. Garrison was running critically low on ammunition after 2 weeks of sustained combat. Food supplies were nearly exhausted with troops on half rations. Wounded accumulated in cave hospitals with minimal medical supplies and no possibility of evacuation. Colonel Yamasaki knew position was hopeless, but was determined to resist as long as possible. Final American assault began May 26th, with renewed effort to break through Japanese lines. Attack was preceded by heaviest artillery bombardment, yet attempted, with every available gun firing at maximum rate for hours. Naval ships moved close to shore to provide point-blank gunfire support. Weather cleared briefly, allowing bombers to attack Japanese positions for first time in week. American infantry attacked behind artillery barrage, advancing through tundra toward Japanese positions on high ground. Fire was intense, as Japanese defenders emptied magazines into advancing Americans. Machine guns cut down entire squads, artillery exploded among attacking troops, snipers shot anyone who exposed themselves. But Americans kept coming, replacing casualties with fresh troops, maintaining pressure that Japanese could not sustain indefinitely. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted as Americans reached Japanese trenches. Combat was savage with rifles, bayonets, knives, grenades, and bare hands. Japanese defenders fought with desperate courage, refusing to surrender even when positions became untenable. Americans had to kill every defender in every bunker, clearing positions one by one through bloody close-quarters combat. The Banzai Charge, May 29th, 0300 hours. Colonel Yamasaki assembled his remaining forces for final operation. Ammunition was nearly gone, food was exhausted, wounded filled cave hospitals, and American pressure was overwhelming. Japanese doctrine called for death before surrender, making situation clear. Yamasaki ordered Banzai Charge, desperate all-out attack with every man who could walk, attempting to break through American lines and destroy supply dumps at landing beaches. Approximately 800 to 1,000 Japanese soldiers assembled in darkness for attack. Wounded men who could walk insisted on participating, determined to die fighting rather than wait for Americans to overrun positions. Some soldiers had only bayonets or swords, having expended all ammunition. Others had few rounds remaining. Many were already injured from earlier fighting, but refused to be left behind. Attack began before dawn, with Japanese forces moving silently toward American positions in fog and darkness. American sentries detected movement and fired, triggering general alarm throughout American lines. Japanese soldiers screamed battle cries and charged forward with shocking violence and determination. Banzai charge hit American positions like tsunami of human fury. Japanese soldiers crashed into trenches, stabbing with bayonets, slashing with swords, throwing grenades, fighting with rifles as clubs when ammunition was gone. Many Japanese were already wounded, blood-soaked bandages visible, but they fought with undiminished ferocity, born of desperation and cultural conditioning. American troops were initially overwhelmed by sheer intensity of attack. Japanese broke through first defensive lines in multiple places, pouring into gaps with hundreds of screaming men. Americans fought desperately, firing point-blank into masses of attackers, but Japanese kept coming over bodies of fallen comrades. Engineers constructing defensive positions were overrun by charging Japanese who killed workers with swords and bayonets. Artillery crews found themselves in hand-to-hand combat, firing howitzers point-blank at charging enemy, then fighting with pistols and tools when Japanese reached gun positions. Medical personnel in aid stations were forced to fight as Japanese penetrated deep into rear areas. Colonel Yamasaki personally led charge, sword in hand, shouting orders and urging men forward. American accounts described Japanese commander fighting at front of his troops, demonstrating courage that impressed even enemies. Yamasaki was killed early in attack, shot down while leading assault. But momentum of Banzai charge continued, with subordinate officers taking command. Hand-to-hand fighting raged across battlefield through early morning hours. Americans fought with everything available: rifles, pistols, knives, shovels, bare hands, as Japanese penetrated deep into defensive positions. Supply dumps were threatened, medical stations were overrun, and for several hours outcome was genuinely uncertain, as Japanese rampage threatened to destroy American positions. But American firepower eventually prevailed through sheer volume and determination. Artillery positioned in rear fired at point-blank range directly into masses of attacking Japanese, killing dozens with each salvo. Machine gunners fired until barrels glowed red-hot, cutting down attackers by hundreds. Infantry fought with desperate courage, matching Japanese ferocity, refusing to be driven back despite overwhelming assault. By mid-morning, Banzai charge had been broken. Japanese had suffered catastrophic casualties without achieving objective of reaching supply dumps. Bodies covered battlefield in heaps where Japanese had fallen. Few prisoners were taken, most only captured because they were wounded unconscious. Vast majority fought until killed, demonstrating commitment to death before surrender that shocked American troops. Remaining Japanese scattered across island were hunted down over next 2 days. Small groups resisted from caves and hidden positions, but were methodically eliminated. Some Japanese committed suicide rather than surrender, using grenades to kill themselves when positions became untenable. May 30th, 1943. Battle of Attu was declared officially over. Attu aftermath casualty figures told story of battle's savage nature. American losses were approximately 550 killed in action and 1,100 wounded in combat. But additional 1,200 became casualties from disease, exposure, accidents, and psychological trauma. Total casualties exceeded 2,800 out of 11,000 engaged. Casualty rate of over 25%, that was among highest for any American battle. Trench foot affected over 1,200 soldiers, with hundreds requiring evacuation and lengthy hospitalization. Frostbite disabled hundreds more, with severe cases requiring amputations. Combat fatigue affected significant portion of combat troops who had endured 3 weeks of fighting in nightmarish conditions. Medical system was overwhelmed with variety and volume of casualties. Japanese losses were total and absolute. Entire garrison of approximately 2,500 men was killed with only 28 captured, most of them wounded and unconscious when found. It was first time in Pacific War that Americans had faced banzai charge and experienced Japanese unwillingness to surrender under any circumstances. Battle provided preview of tactics Americans would encounter repeatedly in subsequent island campaigns. Bodies covered battlefield in such numbers that burial became major logistical challenge. Temporary cemeteries were established on island with plans to repatriate remains after war. Japanese dead received military honors with burial according to available resources, despite having been enemies, reflecting respect that soldiers develop for opponents who fought courageously. Equipment losses were substantial, with vehicles, weapons, supplies, and ammunition lost to weather as much as enemy action. Saltwater corrosion destroyed electronics. Freezing temperatures damaged machinery. Moisture ruined food supplies. Everything brought to Attu required replacement sooner than normal given harsh environment. Victory established that Americans could conduct successful amphibious operations in Aleutian conditions, but at costs that sobered military planners. Terrain and weather had proven as dangerous as enemy action. Duration of battle exceeded estimates by factor of 10. Casualty rates were far higher than anticipated. Lessons learned at Attu would influence planning for subsequent operations. Kiska preparation. Attention turned immediately to Kiska Island, which held much larger Japanese garrison estimated at 5,000 troops, with stronger defenses and better facilities than Attu. American planners expected Kiska assault would require even larger force and produce higher casualties given enemy strength and improved defensive positions. Massive invasion force was assembled consisting of 7th Infantry Division, again despite heavy losses at Attu, plus 1st Special Service Force, elite American-Canadian Commando Unit trained for mountain and winter warfare, and 13th Canadian Infantry Brigade contributing 3,000 Canadian troops. Total invasion force exceeded 34,000 troops, supported by 3 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, 3 light cruisers, 19 destroyers, and supporting vessels. Troops trained extensively for Kiska assault, based on lessons learned at Attu. Cold weather equipment was improved with better parkas, waterproof boots, and insulated sleeping bags. Medical support was enhanced with additional doctors and supplies. Engineers prepared specialized equipment for clearing fortifications. Everyone expected fierce resistance requiring weeks of fighting. American bombers and naval vessels pounded Kiska throughout summer 1943, delivering thousands of tons of explosives on defensive positions. Bombing missions were flown whenever weather permitted, which was rarely. Naval bombardments occurred regularly, with ships firing thousands of shells at estimated target locations. Americans believed sustained bombardment was softening defenses and reducing garrison strength before invasion, but Japanese High Command had reached different conclusion about Kiska garrison. Imperial General Headquarters determined that position was strategically valueless. Given American strength in region, garrison could not be supplied adequately by submarine, and troops would be destroyed in hopeless battle. Decision was made to evacuate entire garrison secretly before American invasion. saving troops for defense of positions closer to Japan. Evacuation operation was extraordinarily risky, given American air and naval presence around Kiska. But Japanese Navy believed operation was possible using fog for concealment and speed for security. Plan called for cruisers and destroyers to approach Kiska during period of thick fog, embark garrison rapidly, and escape at high speed before Americans could react. July 29, 1943. Japanese cruisers Abukuma and Kiso, plus 10 destroyers, approached Kiska under cover of fog so thick that visibility measured in feet. Ships navigated by dead reckoning through poorly charted waters filled with reefs and rocks. In remarkable feat of seamanship and daring, ships reached Kiska Harbor without American detection. Entire garrison of approximately 5,100 troops was embarked in 55 minutes, along with equipment that could be carried. Ships departed immediately, maintaining radio silence, navigating through fog at high speed. Japanese escaped without American detection, reaching safety of Paramushiro Naval Base 4 days later. Evacuation was complete success that demonstrated Japanese Navy's capability for daring operations. Japanese left behind extensive deception measures to suggest garrison remained on island. Radio transmissions continued from automated equipment. Defensive positions were arranged to appear occupied. Booby traps were set throughout installations to cause casualties among invading Americans. Dogs were left barking to suggest human presence. Everything possible was done to make Americans believe island remained defended. The empty island, August 15, 1943. American and Canadian forces landed on Kiska, expecting fierce resistance equal to or exceeding Attu. Landings occurred under covering fire from battleships and cruisers that bombarded island heavily. Aircraft strafed defensive positions. Troops went ashore expecting immediate combat. Initial waves advanced cautiously through fog, anticipating ambush at any moment, but no fire was received. Troops moved inland, clearing positions methodically, but encountered no resistance. Slowly, incredulously, realization spread that island was abandoned. Japanese had evacuated entire garrison without American knowledge. Relief mixed with embarrassment as 34,000 heavily armed troops discovered they had invaded empty island. Some casualties occurred from friendly fire incidents as units engaged each other in fog, mistaking fellow Americans and Canadians for Japanese defenders. Booby traps killed and wounded dozens, but Japanese garrison was completely gone. Strategic implications were debated extensively. Japanese evacuation saved approximately 5,000 troops who would later fight in defense of Kuriles and home islands. But evacuation also represented admission that Aleutian defensive perimeter was untenable. Americans had successfully expelled Japanese from American territory and secured North Pacific. Aleut tragedy. Aleut native populations suffered tremendously during Aleutian campaign through no fault of their own. Those living on Attu when Japanese invaded were captured and transported to Japan, where they were held as prisoners for duration of war. Conditions in Japanese internment camps were harsh, with inadequate food, shelter, and medical care. Approximately half of Attu Aleuts died in captivity from disease, malnutrition, and inadequate care. Aleuts living on other Aleutian islands were forcibly evacuated by American government and transported to internment camps in southeastern Alaska. Evacuation was conducted hastily with families given minimal time to gather possessions. Living conditions in American internment camps were also terrible, with inadequate housing, insufficient food, poor sanitation, and minimal medical care. Mortality rates in American camps were high, as Aleuts succumbed to diseases they had never been exposed to previously. Tuberculosis, influenza, and pneumonia killed dozens. Children and elderly suffered disproportionately. Families were separated, with men sometimes sent to different camps than women and children. When war ended and Aleuts were finally allowed to return home, many found villages had been burned or destroyed by military operations. Traditional subsistence lifestyle was disrupted permanently. Government compensation for losses was minimal. Aleut culture suffered devastating blow that impacts communities to present day. Treatment of Aleuts by both Japanese and Americans remains shameful chapter of Aleutian campaign. Indigenous people whose ancestors had inhabited islands for thousands of years were treated as security threats, forcibly relocated, interned in terrible conditions, and saw traditional culture destroyed. Recognition of injustice and compensation came only decades later. Campaign conclusion. Aleutian campaign officially ended with Kiska reoccupation, though American forces remained in islands throughout war. Bases constructed in Aleutians supported operations against Japanese Kurils and later strategic bombing raids against Japan. Islands served as stepping stones for Lend-Lease supplies delivered to Soviet Union through Alaska-Siberia air route. Strategic impact of campaign remains debated by historians. Japanese occupation tied down American forces and resources that might have been employed elsewhere. But Japanese achieved no significant strategic objective and eventually lost entire garrison at Attu, plus demonstrated vulnerability that encouraged American offensive operations. American victory eliminated threat to Alaska and secured North Pacific, but came at costs exceeding original estimates. Casualties from combat, disease, and exposure totaled thousands. Resources expended on campaign were substantial. Duration exceeded expectations significantly. Environmental damage to islands was severe and long-lasting. Military construction destroyed fragile tundra ecosystems that took decades to recover. Unexploded ordnance littered former battlefields, remaining dangerous for decades. Chemical and fuel contamination affected soil and water. Cleanup operations continued into 21st century, with some areas remaining restricted. Legacy and memory. Aleutian campaign remains largely forgotten by American public, despite being only land campaign fought on incorporated American soil during World War II. Casualties were significant, conditions were extreme, fighting was savage, yet campaign receives minimal attention compared to simultaneous operations at Guadalcanal and subsequent island-hopping campaigns that captured public imagination. Veterans of Aleutian campaign often felt their service was overlooked and underappreciated. They had fought in terrible conditions that exceeded most Pacific islands, suffered casualties from enemy and environment that exceeded many better-known battles, and secured American territory, yet received little recognition. Campaign was overshadowed by more dramatic operations that received extensive press coverage. Strategic lessons from Aleutians influenced later operations significantly. Americans learned critical importance of proper cold weather equipment and training. Medical services developed improved methods for treating and preventing trench foot, frostbite, and hypothermia. Engineers refined techniques for operating in Arctic conditions. Intelligence services improved capabilities for operating in extreme environments. Japanese lessons were equally important, though largely ignored. Loss of Attu garrison demonstrated futility of defending positions that could not be reinforced or supplied. Successful Kiska evacuation showed value of withdrawing rather than sacrificing troops in hopeless situations. But Japanese military culture emphasized death before dishonor, preventing application of these lessons in subsequent campaigns, where garrisons were ordered to fight to death rather than withdraw when positions became untenable. Aleutian Islands National Wildlife Refuge now protects much of island chain, with former battlefields preserved as historical sites. Visitors can see remnants of wartime installations, rusting equipment, collapsed bunkers, and overgrown defensive positions. But accessing islands remains difficult given weather, remoteness, and lack of regular transportation, ensuring most Americans never see where their countrymen fought. Weather in Aleutians remains as terrible today as during war. Fog still blankets islands approximately 300 days annually. Winds still blow with hurricane force regularly. Rain still falls horizontally, driven by relentless gales. Temperatures still hover near freezing even in summer months. Anyone who visits understands immediately why campaign was so difficult and why soldiers who fought there deserve recognition they have never received. The year Japan invaded America remains largely unknown chapter in American history, despite significance. It was invasion and occupation of sovereign United States territory, fought in environmental conditions that tested human endurance beyond normal limits, where weather killed as surely as bullets, and where victory came at tremendous cost measured in lives, resources, and suffering. The forgotten war in Alaska's Aleutian Islands deserves to be remembered as example of courage, endurance, and sacrifice displayed by soldiers on both sides who fought in hell and prevailed despite conditions that seemed designed to make warfare impossible.